Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Pam Schaff, and I'm the director of Keck School of Medicine's HEAL program, Humanities, Ethics, Art, and the Law. And I'm also the director of the Master of Science in Narrative Medicine program here at USC. This Lunch and Learn, sadly without lunch in person this year, but hopefully sometime soon, is one of our initiatives of the HEAL program to bring scholars from the humanities and social sciences to help us inform our collective understanding of the health of individuals, communities, and societies. Today, I want to welcome Dr. Erica Wright, who is the Associate Director of HEAL and of the Master's Program in Narrative Medicine, and she'll be helping with moderating question and answer time today. I also want to give a big shout out for Erin O'Keefe in the Curriculum Office, who is our fearless staff who has helped with putting this together. And now finally, I want to welcome our speakers today and our conversation. So today we're going to be talking about ethos, action, and social justice. What is ours to do in these times of crisis and new possibilities? And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Edgar Rivera, who is a medical anthropologist. He teaches at Columbia University's Narrative Medicine program and will be teaching with us in our Narrative Medicine program this spring. He's an expert in Latinx queer male sexual cultures and trains public health professionals in working with Latinx LGBTQ communities in cultural and structural competency. His forthcoming book is Love Comes in Knots, Meditations in the American Labyrinth. Many of you know Dr. Kairos Llobrera, who is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Programs here at USC. He also, many of you may not know, holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia. His academic interests include US immigration, critical race theory, and 20th century and contemporary US ethnic minority literatures. He is an assistant professor of clinical medical education and teaches in the Narrative Medicine Master's program at USC. So welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you here, to have you as part of our community and part of our faculty, and we very much look forward to your conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you, Dr. Schaff, Dr. Wright, for inviting us. And thank you to all who are attending just to listen to us two guys talk about things, basically. It's such a kind of a privilege to be able to do this. And for people to listen to just us kind of thinking through issues and kind of what we've been going through. I think we can all agree that we're currently living in a moment of multiple crises. We're in the midst of a pandemic, which has had a major impact on people's lives, health, and the economy overall. It's basically disrupted what has been our normal way of life. We're also experiencing a national reckoning on racial injustice in the US, where events have exposed, once again, the structural racism and inequalities in US society. We mourned the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, but we also saw a response in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and anti-racism protests that swept the country over the summer. In thinking about our lunch and learn session today, Edgar and I just really wanted to engage us all in conversation about how we might think about these crises and ask, what do we do? What can we do in such situations? For our discussion today, Edgar and I have both selected pieces, essays, and works of writers that we kind of return to time and again for insights. And we hope to share some of those with you today. Edgar, did you want to add anything before we?
Oh, not really, but I will add this. I just want to concur with you on thanking Dr. Shave and Dr. Wright for inviting us into this forum to talk, to listen, and to engage in a dialogue. One of the things I would say, and it's been great having this conversation with you, Kairos, is that from a social science perspective, our political and social imaginary is exhausted, right? And this is a time for conversation and action where we can imagine sort of if you will, sort of giving life again to a new political imaginary and social imaginary. And there are lots of fronts in which this is happening, but this is one of the fronts that we as educators and as members of the society need to take on. So I hope that our conversation and the general conversation that we're going to have and the questions we're going to field and the responses will be part of that process. But it's great to be here, and it's great to be in Los Angeles finally, and it's nice to be bi-coastal.
It is a privilege, having lived in New York as well.
Right.
But our weather here is definitely better. So I think to ground, I think for me, as I've been reflecting on kind of in preparation for this, the essay that I've returned to is a piece by Audre Lorde. It's called The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. It's an essay that's included in her collection, The Cancer Journals, but it was originally given as a speech in 1977 at the Lesbian and Literature panel of the Modern Language Association, actually. So for those of you who aren't familiar, or I just want to give a little bit a sketch of who Audre Lorde is, and then highlight the key points of the piece that we're discussing, so that we kind of have an idea of what, and we're engaging with the same material. So Audre Lorde was born in New York City in 1934 to West immigrant parents. She died in 1992 at the age of 58 from cancer. So Lorde herself described, she described herself as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet. So a lot of identities there. In her writings and in her life, she confronted and addressed injustices of racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia. She's made a lot of contributions to feminist theory, critical race studies, queer theory, often using her personal experiences to speak to broader political issues. Some of you may have heard of or even read an essay which has been canonical. It's called The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House, which I hope is still being read in undergrad courses. Maybe Erica knows. In that essay, she writes, quote, "It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." But again, for today's conversation, I've really been thinking about this other piece, which is the transformation of silence into language and action, which I think really has so many lessons for us when we think about social justice and consider the question, what is ours to do in these times of crisis and possibilities? Maybe Aaron can put up the quotes as kind of, I'll just give us an overview of the essay. So in the essay, Lorde talks about having to face her mortality when she was told by doctors she needed surgery to remove a tumor they found in her breast. When she was reflecting on her life during this period between being told about the tumor and the surgery, she says that what she regretted most were her silences, the moments when she did not speak the truths she knew and the truths she was still speaking. In thinking about the question, what is ours to do, especially in relation to matters concerning social justice, I'm inspired by this movement, this process that she describes as the transformation of silence into language and action. When we see injustices all around us, we might ask ourselves, in what ways have we been silent? And then when we finally get up the courage to break the silence, how do we move from silence to language and action? Since we didn't share this essay for you to read, I'm gonna take a few moments to kind of give us an outline and the main points that she makes. So Lorde begins by saying, "I've come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood." I think to me, this is where many of us can start really, by asking ourselves, what is it that matters to me? What is important? Then we need to find the words to communicate this to others. even as she says, if it risks being bruised or misunderstood. Speaking is the opposite of silence. Quite powerfully, she says, my silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. She goes on to say, what are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own, until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence? Our silence doesn't protect us, she says. In fact, it can make us sick and could lead to our demise. And when we think of these tyrannies and injustices, we might understand sickness and death in both metaphorical and literal ways, you know, especially when we think about COVID and health disparities. But moving from silence to language is difficult. Lord says that we often remain silent and don't speak because we're afraid. Speaking is both risky and scary, right? When she delivered this speech at the MLA, she says, and of course I'm afraid, you can hear it in my voice, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation that always seems fraught with danger. When we move from silence to language, we expose ourselves. We reveal to others the things we believe in, the things we care about, the things we worry about, and really the things we're angry about. The potential danger here is that we will encounter those who will disagree with us or those who will oppose us. We expose ourselves to contempt, censure, judgment, challenge, and as she says, even annihilation. And here's the interesting bit for me. Lord says that we remain silent because we fear the very visibility without which we also cannot truly live. We fear becoming known, recognized, and seen. But if we aren't seen, if we aren't visible, we aren't truly living either. But this visibility is critical because, as she says, quote, that visibility which makes us most vulnerable is that which also is the source of our greatest strength. Here I can't help but think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-racism demonstrations we saw earlier this year. In those marches and demonstrations, calls for racial justice and social justice were made visible. I think we can all kind of agree with that. The people who marched were in a vulnerable position, especially when they encountered police or other hostile resistance. But I think what many of us saw during those marches as well was the strength of the people who were willing to speak up. So when we move from silence to language and action, Lord says, quote, it is vitally necessary for each one of us to establish or examine her function in that transformation and to recognize her role as vital within that transformation. We have to ask, what is our function? What is our role? Again, in reflecting on these questions can help us get to that, question that we're asking today, what is ours to do? And the work will be different for everyone. For a writer and poet like Lord, she says, it is necessary to scrutinize not only the truth of what we speak, but the truth of that language by which we speak it. For others, it is to share and spread also those words that are meaningful to us. But of course, not all of us are poets gifted with the language facility that she has. So she says, basically, for all of us, it is necessary to teach by living and speaking those truths which we believe and know beyond understanding. So this is very practical advice, and I think I want to leave it here in terms of my introduction. If we want to transform our silence into language and action, we can take her cue and kind of follow. The one thing we can really do is to teach by living and speaking the truths which we believe and know beyond our understanding. Yeah, so Edgar, I was curious about other things in that piece that kind of spoke to you. You said that, I think in our email conversations, she had mentioned, yeah, this is also a piece that you you go back frequently to.
Yeah, I do. And part of it is this question of visibility, but also collectivity, right? That one of the challenges that we have at this moment in which we're living these, what I call multiplex crises, you know, as you've noted, the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the racial justice crisis, a political, if you will, elite crisis, you know, when you think about it, and a climate crisis, right? That part of that is that we have to begin to imagine new collectivities. And in fact, I think that's what happened in the rebellion that we saw in the last couple of months. And to go back to a beautiful memoir, there's a beautiful memoir by a Black gay science fiction writer, Sam Delaney, called The Motion of Light and Water. And the subtitle is Sex and Science Fiction in the East Village of the 1950s, right? And Delaney comes from this old sort of Black family of like people who've been excellent in their careers, but also have been very concerned about social justice. And what Delaney does, he talks about moments in his own life as growing up as a queer man, where he was with queer men and realized, oh, we're a collectivity. You know, that people had actually built institutions, places where people could meet, ways of relating to each other, which allowed him to develop that identity. And I think what we saw this summer, what I saw as an observer, was young people, many of them were young people, going to the streets. Why? Because think about the prospects of young people in this country. Think about the student loan debt of young people in this country. Think about the hopes that we socialize young people in this country with. And then when it comes to the moment of payoff, they say, sorry, we got to wait another 30 years. So I think there was a lot of anger. And when I was growing up, I wasn't an angry person. I was a very good boy, got a scholarship. And from the age of 13 to 23, I said to people, I lived in a white world as an exceptional brown person, right? And I think I began to sort of interrogate that, ask, why is this not comfortable for me? And it was like a moment in my life when I began to say, I need a new story. This is not my story. And I think that's what I'm hearing young people between the ages of 18 and 40 saying, this cannot be the story for us. And I think as people who are interested in narrative, interested in how people imagine their futures, we're in a critical phase. One of my comrades, Kalia Kunu in Mississippi, in an interview, he said something very insightful. And Kali works on eco sort of sustainability and autonomy of peoples. He's a key figure in the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And Kali said something really fascinating. He said he thought that the actual Black Lives Matter movement was a delayed response to Katrina, right? And the failures of the Obama administration. And he's coming from the left, right? He's coming to the left of Obama. And I think there's something to that. So when I saw that movement, right, I was very happy, of course, but I was also like, why at this moment has this become so visible? And I think what it is people are responding to decades of things that haven't been attended to, that people haven't taken on the vocational challenge of what is ours to do. And embedded in those questions are other questions like, who are our people, right? Who are your people, right? And also, of this life that I'm living, why this life instead of something else? And those of us who are involved in education, professional education, higher education, in one sense, what I'm really interested in with my students is discernment. How do we discern the times we're living in? What are the balance of forces at play? What are the possibilities for freedom here, right? And what are the possibilities of developing a new language? And I think for me, what Audre Lorde did was to give me a language that allowed me to act within my identities and to come to some understanding what the role of difference is in this life, right? Oftentimes, and I come from the left, right? We talk about unity in an abstract way, but unity is built on the recognition of concrete shared needs in their differentiality. So if I'm a person who needs dialysis, for example, right? My needs are a little different than someone who doesn't, right? If I'm a person who's COVID-19, it's a little different. And we all have to figure out that piece of unity. And usually what people do is they do stuff and then they build on those needs. Now, what's the challenge here? The challenge here is that we are seeing the settler state, the white settler state, in crisis, not only in the United States, but globally, right? And the response has been a fear response. So you see the kind of regimes we have in Brazil, in Hungary, and India, in the US, in Russia, in China. All these are responses to this big crisis. And I think that we have to be ready on some level to understand that those solutions won't work for us. They're out of fear. And there was a great philosopher that no one really reads anymore, but he said that fear is caused by the imagination of a future evil, which is either corruptive or painful, right? And so we have to confront this fear. And one of the things we have to say is we have to name the system. It's a white settler system. It's a white supremacist system. For me, as a Marxist, it's racial capitalism in its patriarchal forms, and certainly as a queer man. And so what I think is important for me is to keep on asking myself these two basic questions. What is happening now? And what are the sources of our hope? Because believe me, I can do a really brutal analysis, which will not make us hopeful, right? And that has its power, right? But we're not just rational beings. We're beings with emotions, with affect, with connections. And if you had told me in the 80s that Mandela would be the president of South Africa, I would say you're mad, right? But that's what happens, right? So I think we're in a really important moment where we can see the ground shifting and the discourse shifting. And I have to be humbled. I mean, I've been an activist since I was 18, and I did not prepare the way for what's happening now. Young people have prepared that way. And so that's an important thing to sort of, first of all, for young folks who are rebelling, that 18 to 40 crowd, congratulations, you're doing it right. Assume the authority of your own power, right? And we need to be allies in that. And then we have to figure out the institutional pieces. Like we have to figure out, like what Dr. Gutierrez's piece is about is, okay, we're gonna have an anti-racist curriculum, but we have to do more than that. There's practices that have to be addressed and hirings that have to be addressed and all this other stuff that has to be addressed. Otherwise, it becomes window dressing. And one thing I've noticed, having worked with young people a good part of my life, is that the youth in this country know when they're being offered a scam, right? They know. I mean, you know, in one sense, TikTok is derivative of that, right? And I think that we need to think together, what does it mean to engage in health justice as a form of collective discernment and action at this moment, right? And that's why we were talking about ethos, because we didn't want to live it strictly at the level of, here's a great text, right? Read this text, that's great. It was more like, okay, what are the ethical reasoning communities that we're part of, and what are our projects, right? Because if I want to get to know you, Kairos, I do something with you. I do a project with you, because then I get to know you as a person, what you like to do, right? And as human beings, if you will, Marx used to tell, right, would say that the species being of human beings is that ability to labor creatively with each other, right? And I think that this is a moment where we can do this stuff. But this is hard stuff. This is confronting our ghost, our history, and understanding the past, as so many of the post-colonial and decolonial theorists have taught us, that it's still going on, that colonialism is still going on. So when I saw those statues coming down all over the world, in England and all kinds of places, I knew that's the first symbolic step. You have to address the symbols and then get down to the ground of reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think really this question of ethos was really important when we were thinking about this, right? So, because in many ways, that's a good starting place, right? Because when we think of ethos, we can think of it in terms of kind of the big picture characteristic spirit of a community, a culture, an era. but rhetorically, ethos is also kind of like establishing where the speaker comes from, right? And I think at the individual level, for especially for young people who are trying to make sense of where they fit and what they can do, I think kind of thinking through that, like, where do I speak from, right?
Yeah.
And what grounds my notion, for example, of social justice, right? Like,
Yeah.
and here's the tricky thing, right? So with language, it's very slippery. If you don't define the words for yourself, someone's going to define it for you. And that's troubling. I think this is why Lord's piece really kind of speaks to me. She's like, I got to break this silence, and I have to put into words the truths that I know, right? And I think this is really important for medical students, for example, right? We can't, there's a lot of right now, there's a lot of interest in anti-racism curriculum and doing initiatives that are geared towards social justice. But I think all of us, whether students, faculty, or staff, we have to really kind of do that internal work of examining, what does that mean for me, right? And where does that come from? And I think that's something that you and I have been talking through and thinking about. How do we get students, how do we get people to start kind of interrogating what social justice means for them, and where is it grounded, right? I like when you talk about this notion of formation. How again, we're a little older than med students, so it's like
just a wee bit.
We know we've had the privilege to kind of make sense of this for ourselves, right? As we either through academics or like personal experiences. But for young people, how do we get them to start thinking about these things? Okay, when I'm thinking about health justice, for example, what am I basing that notion of justice on, right?
Right.
You had mentioned at one point, you're like, yeah, use the clinical experience.
Yeah.
What are you seeing there, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And it's for me, a lot of and this is going to sound old-fashioned, but we're all part of communities of practical moral reasoning, right? And a lot of that practical moral reasoning for our med students occurs in the clinical moment, right? And I came out of very different traditions. I came out of the Catholic humanist Jesuit tradition. I came out of the liberation theology, the Marxist tradition, the LGBT, and I had to figure out at one point, okay, what is the commonality here of these traditions, right? And I think I came to the conclusion that for me, the foundation of moral or ethical reasoning and collective action is based upon what will allow us to build our capacities such that everyone is seen as an equal human being. If we were to say that what our project is in liberation or freedom is the full flourishing of the potential that human beings have, right, for creativity, for affinity, for solidarity, then that's a foundation for me, right, of these different parts of my identity. I'll tell you a story. When I was a young man, I was in Nicaragua. I was a member of the Jesuits at that time. I left later, but I ran into these Cuban doctors, right? And I said to them, why are you sending doctors here? You're a poor country. And they said something really instructive to me. They said, well, this is the thing. We believe in solidarity, not in charity. We believe that you have to give of your substance, not of your surplus. And they said to me, that's the difference between our medicine and capitalist medicine, right? And, I have my critique of the Cuban system in certain ways, but to listen to them say, as people of the South, of the global South, we're in solidarity with folks in Nicaragua, and that ethos, which includes your emotions and your feelings and culture, was key to them. And I think that that's something that we should consider. What is at the heart of our ethos? What is the foundation for our belief in justice? Is it strictly individual, right? Like the libertarian tradition in this country? And that's not doing well with us in this country. When no one can tell me anything, I don't have to wear a mask. That's really counterproductive and lethal, literally, right? So maybe we can begin to explore those foundations and then act, be in conjunction with people, find your folks, right? And do projects together. Because I think this is an incredible, as you were saying, this is an incredible time for collective formation. And again, I'm going to take responsibility as an old lefto. We did not create the infrastructure for the kind of political, ethical, and educational formation for the generation that exists now. And I think we're in that process of doing that. And this is going to sound, again, a little crazy, but to change the United States in the way we think might be a good change, we're talking 20, 30, 40 years, right, from my perspective. Unless history does totally something different, and I'm happy for that to happen, right? But I think that there's a piece here that we can learn from our students, and also figuring out what traditions are informing my ideas. And also tradition comes from Latin, right? Tradio tadere. It's handed over. Well, there's some stuff that you need to hand back, right? That's racist, that's homophobic, that's sexist, that's classist. So we have a critical understanding of our traditions, both of medical education itself, but the other broader traditions that we're part of. So I think this is a time when these kind of conversations need to happen. And this is reflection on what we've been going through, we need mercy. You know, we need a type of radical mercy, right? Which doesn't mean you get off the hook, right? It means that you're aware that other people are in process of development, such that we can entertain what would it be like in the United States to have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, like they had in South Africa, where we confront our history, right? And do it in a real way. And I think that's one of the things that we lack in the United States, is the real confrontation. And that's why people are pulling down statues, because they're saying, no, that's not us. That can't be the history that I live into.
I think that's really great, actually, because that has been, I feel like, a challenge for many of us, right? We're in this place where there's just so much, for lack of a better term, just really anger, right? And we are so fed up with a lot of things that we're seeing, the injustices we're seeing, and it's hard to practice mercy. It's hard to practice grace, right? You know, and we try to tell others to practice it, but how do you teach it, right? Like, and again, here, this is why I really like Lord's piece. This is why it's kind of just been really kind of speaking to me. In that essay, she talks about these, she talks about what she calls these imposed separations, right? Between where we focus on our difference. She talks about it in terms of writing, as, you know, because she was giving this at the MLA. And the example that she says are like, you know, conversations that she hears from teachers, for example. So she says, I can't possibly teach Black women's writing. Their experience is so different from mine. Or she's a white woman. What could she possibly have to say to me? Or she's a lesbian. What would my husband say? Or my chairman? Or this woman writes of her sons and I have no children, right? Like, I feel like, at least my observation is we're kind of in a similar moment where we're just like, we're so scared of breaching those differences, like imposed separations, right? And so it's like, oh, okay, this issue relates to that. So I'll be on the sidelines, support you, but don't feel comfortable moving into that space, right? So how do we navigate that? And I think what Lord is really saying there is like, you know, when we do this, when we maintain these boundaries, it robs us of ourselves and each other, right?
Right. No, that's
this breaking of that boundary is where mercy needs to take place, I feel
right.
like.
No, you're right. You're right. And it's funny, one of the foundational texts of feminism of color, when like people like Audre Lorde, people like Cheryl Clark, people like Sherry Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, when they wrote that book together, that collection, This Bridge Called My Back, what they were saying was that women of color have been forced to be bridges, right, by the structural inequalities they confront. Now we're going to be bridges because we've chosen that, because we're choosing to bridge these, and that we're organizing within our differences, not against them necessarily, right? Those are important points to think about, right? Erin, would you be so kind as to put up the Kevin Gutierrez quote? Because it's a sharp thing, but I also think we need his sharpness. And transparency here, Kevin was my student at Columbia. But let's just read this. Consider an institution that says it's committed to anti-racism and has added mandatory anti-racism training, broadcasting that we're paying attention to this topic. And we can think about the way diversity training is being treated by the administration in Washington. So we can think about a different context here. Yet it has no Black or Latinx senior faculty, supports no research dedicated to studying racism specifically, has poor retention rates of Black and Latinx clinicians, has a history of retaliating against employees or clinicians who speak up, and presents no plan for addressing their issues, or has excluded its own members of color from participating in the planning. What does a new anti-racism curriculum do set against the backdrop of these structurally racist practices? It directs attention away from that very examination. And the New England Journal of Medicine published this, which is pretty radical, because of social movement. Right? So you can take that away. And thanks so much for the PDF, if you know. And I think that what Dr. Gutierrez is pointing to is there has to be structural change. It can't be window dressing, and there has to be mercy, and there has to be institutional collective discernment. And discernment is about, okay, of the various choices we have in front of us, which one would bring us to a fuller realization of the mission of the institution, right? And institutions, of course, have their economic exigencies and all things like that, no doubt. But collective discernment is what we need now. And the mercy piece is interesting, right? Because if I'm merciful to myself, right, that's one thing that we all need to do, right? About our own histories. It's also a projection of mercy as saying, I realize that I'm holding space for certain people, but I'm doing it for their development, so I don't never have to hold space again, right? And I don't want the burden to always be on people of color either, or queer people, or women, right? But at the same time, it's a dialectic in history. We want to get there, but we're going to have to get there to the present contradictions we're living in, right? We're going to have to figure out, C.L.R. James used to say, the future in the present, right? And I think that when I look at the panorama of our society today and the crises that are occurring and the imposed structural loneliness that the pandemic has imposed and the things that it's revealed. I mean, the pandemic has been apocalyptic in the Greek sense of the word. It's, we have some really silly interpretations of the Bible in this country, but the apocalypse at the end of the Bible, or the New Testament, I should say, the Greek Testament, simply says, look, this is how an empire works, right? This is what it is, right? And think about it this way, Kairos. You and I would not be having this conversation if the United States had not invaded the Philippines in 1898 or Puerto Rico in 1898. You have a Spanish surname. I have a Spanish surname, right? In my case, it's Corsican and African and Indian, but the very fact that we're having this conversation indexes that colonial and imperialist history, right? And so I think as men of color who come from colonized people, right, we have to have that conversation about our histories. Like literally, we would not know each other had it not been for Teddy Roosevelt, right? Right. Or the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt, let's put it that way. But so I think that this is a great time to really start thinking about that and being sharp in our analysis, being fearless, and at the same time, there has to be a room for hope and also a belief. And this is a belief I cannot defend on scientific terms. I can only defend it on how I've lived. I have to have a belief that other people are gonna develop, and that I'm gonna develop with them. That's just an important thing. And if you would, Erin, I just wanna give Ricardo Falla a shout out, one of my favorite Central American anthropologists, who did incredible work amongst the Mayan people in Guatemala during the genocide. And Ricardo's in his 80s now. He's still trucking. And he just finished his 5-volume work on all the stuff he was writing that he could not publish because he was amidst communities, Mayan communities, living with them, and they were under literal persecution and death. And he talks a lot about genocide. But in one of his writings, he says, and this is an 80-year-old something anthropologist and a Jesuit priest coming to a certain recognition, a type of wisdom that, please God, one day I'll have, and that we'll all have. And if you could just go to the other quote there, Aaron, I would appreciate it. The quote from, he says, and it's almost like this sense of like, here, I'm 80-something years old, I'm an anthropologist, this is how I see my life now. You won't be examined on how many books you've written, nor on how many buildings you've erected, nor on how many positions you've had, or even how many sick people you saved from death. Sorry, he's got a different criteria. He says, what matters is how much you've loved, how much love you've put into everything you've done. And I think what Ricardo is talking about, and you could take this slide out now, thank you so much, is not sentimental love. He's talking about the hard energy of love that transforms institutions and people. And I think that's where we're at today in the United States. We really are at that pivot point, right? And part of me is like, wow, this is really messed up. And part of me is like, okay, I come from a colonized people. My people were slaves in Puerto Rico up until 1873. And I have indigenous blood. My folks went through colonization. We've been through worse, believe it or not, and we're gonna move forward. But I say that as a way of challenging us to seize the moment, right? To stand and fight in a principled way with our comrades and colleagues, right? Because they're in the project with us. And also think about, okay, what's our next step? And that great question, I have to be, Mindy Full of Love gave me that question, the social psychiatrist who wrote Root Shock. And the question was, what is ours to do? And I guess today was, what is ours to talk about?
I think we can keep going and going about this, but we want to leave some time for questions and discussion. Really, we want to engage with everyone who's joined us today. So please, if we're open to questions.
Yes, please.
Feel free to put questions either in the chat or to unmute yourselves and ask away.
I'm not so much sure if I have a question, but if you don't mind me just, reflecting a little bit, I just, really appreciate, I felt it was inspiring, a realistic assessment of the profoundly problematic situation we find ourselves in, and I would say potentially despairing, but also kind of articulating some of these things that can give us hope. And it just made me think that I was Cornell West and Trisha Rose interviewed Noam Chomsky recently on a podcast. And it was amazing. He's 91 years old, and his breakdown of everything was just like incredible. And yet he maintained like a profound hope, and really I can't repeat it as lucidly as he did. He was just like, these three things, he's like, it's a total hot mess, and the empire is striking back. And he also really highlighted the climate change thing. He's like, this is not a dress rehearsal. This is the real problem. Like we are at a profound existential crossroads, really. And it's this threat. There's like a legitimate threat of humanity extincting itself. Like that's not just like hyperbole. There's massive database. And he really brought that out. And yet he was still able to, cite youth movements and possibilities for drawing on our deepest resources. And I think also in some work I'm doing right now, where I'm studying system science and complexity theory in relationship to the health system. But one of the things is that in highly kind of chaotic, complex systems, there can be these radical instabilities where our systems are far from equilibrium, and they can jump into a whole new thing. They call it a bifurcation point or a catastrophe. And in our moment, it's like it can go towards, you know, destruction and some really horrible dystopia. And yet that profound instability is also like an opportunity for a phase shift into the work that we've been doing, and a sense of, you know, what it is for us to do is to recognize that we are the ones we've been waiting for, and that we do have to stand up. And I think, Kairos, you mentioned, you know, how challenging and the vulnerability of standing up and speaking and saying, you know, I struggle with this all the time. How much do you put yourself out there? How much do, you know, the institutions, the people you work for, this, you know, can crush you like a bug pretty easily if your trust fund isn't fully funded, you know, and yet this is what the times call us to do. And Edgar, your mention too of like how indigenous people and enslaved peoples, like this, they've been going through these things, you know, for a long time. And part of my Irish history, you know, it was the first colony of England, and there's a historical trauma in all of that, even though, you know, I mostly enjoy white privilege at this point here, but it's definitely part of my memory. And in that sense is how can this chaos and despair, you know, bring us forward into a new narrative, a new story, and new possibilities. And I try to think of it as, even if it doesn't work out, we know that the work we do has intrinsic merit, and that when it comes time to meet our maker, and however you conceive of that, you can say, I did the best I could. I tried to love. I tried to show up for what's before us, and I tried to leave something to the next generations, which I've learned a lot from indigenous people. I tried to think what 7 generations from now might need to do, and I tried. We tried.
Thanks for sharing.
This is
Hey,
Deepu.
people, how are you?
Edgar, great to see you, brother.
Namaste.
Thank you so much for inviting me all to join you all today. So I'm Deepu Gada. I'm a general internist and the assistant dean for medical education at the New Medical School at Kaiser Permanente. And prior to that, I had spent 20 years at Columbia University, where I was with Edgar teaching at the master's program in narrative medicine. So my question, you know, I think this talk was so beautiful, and I'm so glad that you ended towards the end with, you know, Ricardo Fala's, you know, statements around love. You know, it makes me think about the moment that we're in and how much turmoil that we've gone through to be able to have the kind of conversations that we're having, that, you know, Kevin Gutierrez was able to get published in the New England Journal with this very kind of dramatic, you know, shaking us awake piece on anti-racism efforts in medical education and in healthcare, and the kind of hypocrisy that's often behind those statements of us being anti-racist. But I also feel like these moments come and go. And I wanted to ask you both, what is it, you know, we're at a place now where we're building a new medical school. USC is now taking this amazing step of creating a master's program in narrative medicine. What are things that we can do to embed in the very structure of our institutions this notion of love that you end with, that's so powerful and that's so connected to this deepest meaning of one's life, but I also think is the most powerful transformative force that we can have in our world. It sometimes feels very kind of anti-academic. Oh, what is love? So how do you translate that into how institutions actually function?
Right. That's a brilliant question, Deepa. That's a brilliant question, and a timely one too. Would you like to respond? Take a stab at it.
I think this is your area. Yeah, I think you're right though. It's hard, especially when we think about conceptions of love, right? Like people throw around that word, and I think Edgar's kind of explanation of what it means might lead us to kind of how we implement that in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think Deepu, you're spot on, and it's funny. It's like in the academy, the way we're trained is to not be sentimental and I actually don't think love is about sentiment. It's about a type of labor, right? The kind of labor, well, sometimes the only way to approach this is through metaphor, right? But the love ethic is also about telling people you have a vocation to be healers. And you are scientists, you have a craft that predates the modern tradition, right? Called medicine, right? And you also have this other piece of being a healer. And that healing piece on some level has to be animated by love. And the love that I'm thinking about is the kind of, there's a seed, right? There's a piece of it that's about future work. Like I think about my own writing, right? I'm writing now a book. I'm not writing it for myself. I'm writing it for my nieces and nephews as a postcard, right? And I think that that love involves a future tense of the possibility of another life. And I'm thinking right now, and I've been thinking a lot about the moment of George Floyd's death when he cried out for his mom, for his mother. And why did he? Because the gaze of the mother is the gaze that you want when you're in distress, right? And I think that when you're in the healing arts, for me, it's part of that is the tradition of ancestors, part of it is, the great cloud of witnesses, but it's also about our institutions speaking that word. Like, do we talk about love? Do we talk about a calling to heal, right? And I think there's a piece that is about nonviolence, right? To do no harm is to engage people nonviolently, right? And I'm not a pacifist, right? Just to make that clear. But I think you're right. I think there's a piece, and also pedagogy. How do we teach our students? Do we teach them in authoritarian manners, in ways that, are not dialogical? And you're right, the whole narrative medicine tradition is an attempt to get at that piece of the dialogical, the intersubjective, the place between you and me. I call it soul work, not the soul that's like a ghost in the machine or clinging to you in one sense, but it's what happens when people come together for their collective development. You know it, Deepa, you know it from your workshop work, the work you do around art, the work you're doing now as a dean, as a founding faculty member at Kairos Permanente. And I think that ethos is there, and we can mobilize it and not be ashamed of it, not be ashamed of like being seen as like soft or not scientific, and think about the gender language there, right?
Yeah. Like
all the soft sciences or the whole gender piece is implicit in that. So I think that, for me, writing became a pleasure when I've written out of love. Teaching becomes a pleasure when I realize I'm doing this because there's knowledge there, there's wisdom there, but also because I don't know what will happen. And these people will take it places I never imagined. And that's an act of love, right? So I think we need a better language of love, right? But we also need to say our institutions have to be built on some level around love. They can't be simply bottom line. They can't be bean counting. They have to do the bean counting, but there has to be something else, something more than that. And I think that's a great question. That's a brilliant question. And it's something that, we're all struggling with. We're all struggling with. Every morning I hear my niece, my 7-year-old niece, her first grade, they have a little song, good morning, and they're so excited, they're in the virtual learning space. And I think to myself as a teacher, yeah, that's the excitement that we need in the teaching, right? That's the excitement that we need.
Well, this is a great segue for us to also to continue this work and this kind of developing our collective collectivity in the workshops that you and Kairos are going to be running, and inviting faculty, staff, and students to be part of to continue this work. And I also think one of the things in my own teaching that I think maybe it's a part of love is that idea of vulnerability and of being together. Like that's another kind of way that we have a collective, a unity, is that we're all feeling this vulnerability in different ways, and that might be a form of love, is to share that and model that with our students. And certainly that's the narrative medicine methods to kind of recognize and embrace that uncertainty that makes us feel vulnerable. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. We're at the end of our time together. Edgar and Kairos, magnificent conversation. I feel as if I've not only learned a lot, but been inspired in new and challenging ways. Thank you to all of you for joining, and we will have another Lunch and Learn in November with 2 faculty members from our master's program and a colleague from University Park campus. And stay tuned for details on that. And as well, we look forward to narrative medicine workshop with Edgar and Kairos to be announced shortly. Thanks everyone so much
for having us.
Thank you for having us.